What happens when orcs find a red scorpion's dreadnought in the Eye of Terror? In the grim darkness of the far future, where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blur into meaninglessness, there exist places where even the most hardened warriors fear to tread. The Eye of Terror stands as perhaps the most infamous of these cursed regions, a massive wound in the fabric of space itself, where the physical universe and the churning madness of the warp bleed into one another. It is here, in this realm of impossible geometries and demonic nightmares, that one of the strangest encounters in the endless war of the 41st millennium would unfold. An encounter between the brutal, pragmatic cunning of the orcs and the tragic nobility of a fallen space marine hero, locked forever in a walking tomb of ceramite and adamantium. The story begins not with grand strategic movements or the clash of armies, but with something far more personal and infinitely more tragic. Somewhere in the twisted labyrinth of reality that comprises the Eye of Terror, an orc warband prowls through the ruins of what might once have been an imperial world, though the passage of time and the corrosive touch of chaos have rendered such determinations nearly impossible. The sky above shifts between colors that have no names in any mortal tongue, while the ground beneath their feet pulses with a rhythm that seems almost alive, almost aware. These orcs belong to no great war, no legendary campaign that will shake the foundations of the Imperium. They are raiders, scavengers, the flotsam and jetsam of a dozen failed invasions who have found themselves drawn into the Eye of Terror's embrace through a combination of bad luck, worse navigation, and the kind of reckless curiosity that defines their species. Their war boss, a brute called Gragmek Ironjaw, stands perhaps 9 feet tall when fully extended, his massive frame sheathed in a patchwork of looted armor plates that bear the heraldry of a dozen different Imperial regiments and Space Marine chapters. His face, what little of it remains visible beneath layers of scar tissue and crude bionics, bears the perpetual grin of a creature that has found paradise in hell. The warband numbers perhaps 300 strong, a modest force by orc standards, but one that has proven surprisingly resilient in the nightmarish environment of the Eye. They have learned, through bitter experience and countless casualties, that the normal rules of reality hold little sway here. Gravity might reverse itself without warning. Time flows like water, pooling in some places and rushing past in others. The very air they breathe carries whispers of madness, promises of power, and the eternal laughter of thirsting gods who care nothing for the struggles of mortal beings. It is one of Gragmek's scouts, a smaller orc called Snipper, who has somehow survived long enough to develop something approaching tactical sense, who first spots the anomaly. In a landscape where every shadow might hide a demon and every structure could be a trap woven from crystallized screams, the object stands out precisely because it seems real, solid, anchored to the material universe in a way that nothing else in this accursed place manages to achieve. The Dreadnought lies half buried in what might charitably be called Earth, though the substance shifts between states of matter in ways that would drive a rational mind to despair. Its ceramite hull bears the distinctive grey and yellow coloration of the Red Scorpion's Space Marine chapter, though the paint has been scorched and corroded by exposure to the Eye's warped atmosphere. One arm ends in a massive power fist, its energy coils long dormant, but still intact. The other mounts what appears to be a twin-linked lascannon, its barrels pointed uselessly at the churning sky above. The sarcophagus itself, the armored tomb that houses what remains of the Space Marine within, shows signs of catastrophic damage. Massive tears in the plating suggest it was brought down by something with terrible power, possibly a demon prince or a chaos dreadnought, though the nature of the final battle remains unknowable. Snipper, demonstrating the kind of self-preservation instinct that is remarkably rare among his kind, does not immediately approach the fallen war machine. Instead, he circles it at a cautious distance, his keen eyes taking in every detail. The Dreadnought is not moving, shows no signs of active power systems, yet there is something about it that troubles even his limited capacity for unease. Perhaps it is the way the warped light of the eye seems to slide off its surfaces rather than soak into them. Perhaps it is the scroll of purity seals that still cling to its chassis, their words of benediction somehow resistant to the corruption that has claimed everything else in this place. Or perhaps it is simply that Snipper has survived this long by trusting his instincts, and his instincts are currently screaming that this thing, this half-dead monument to a failed empire, represents both opportunity and terrible danger. When Gragmek and his mob arrive, summoned by Snipper's excited vox squawks, the warboss's reaction is immediate and predictable. His eyes, one biological and clouded with scar tissue, the other a crude bionic that clicks and whirs as it focuses, light up with the peculiar mixture of greed and joy that only an orc can truly experience. Here, lying before him like a gift from Gork and Mork themselves, is a prize beyond measure. A Space Marine Dreadnought, one of the legendary walking tanks that the Humies use to house their greatest warriors. Never mind that it appears dead, possibly beyond repair. Never mind that they have absolutely no idea how such a machine operates or what systems keep its entombed occupant alive. To Gragmek Ironjaw and his mob of scrap-hungry mech boys, this represents the find of a lifetime. The warband spreads out around the fallen Dreadnought, establishing a perimeter that is less about tactical awareness and more about making sure none of the boys try to claim the best bits before the warboss has had his pick. Several of the larger orcs begin the process of digging away the strange earth substance that has partially swallowed the war machine, their massive hands moving tons of material with brutal efficiency. Others simply stand and stare, their crude minds struggling to process the magnitude of what they have found. It is at this moment, as dozens of greenskin hands begin to touch the Dreadnought's surface, that something remarkable happens. Deep within the armored sarcophagus, systems that have lain dormant for an unknowable period of time begin to stir. Power cells that should have been exhausted decades ago flicker to life. The spirit of the machine, that mystical force that the Adeptus Mechanicus worship and orcs instinctively understand, responds to the presence of so much aggressive life force. The orcs' innate psychic field, that gestalt phenomenon that allows their ramshackle technology to function despite violating every known law of physics, washes over the Dreadnought like a tide of green-tinged energy. Within the sarcophagus, floating in amniotic fluid that has long since grown stagnant and corrupt, a consciousness stirs. Brother Ancient Tiberius of the Red Scorpions, chapter, who has slept for what feels like centuries in the endless nightmare of the Eye of Terror, begins the slow, agonizing process of awakening. His organic components, the few that remain after countless surgeries, and the trauma that necessitated his internment in this walking tomb, scream with pain that is both phantom and terribly real. His mechanical systems, responding to commands that he does not consciously give, begin their startup sequences. Optical sensors that have not functioned in untold years flicker to life. Audio receptors crackle with static before resolving into the harsh, guttural sounds of orc speech. And slowly, inexorably, consciousness returns to a mind that has known only darkness and nightmare for longer than it cares to remember. The first thing Tiberius experiences upon awakening is confusion. The last thing he remembers clearly is battle. His company had been pursuing a warband of word-bearers who had raided an imperial shrine world, stealing sacred relics and butchering thousands of the faithful. The pursuit had led them to the edge of the Eye of Terror, to a world that existed half in real space and half in the warp. The word-bearers had been desperate, cornered, and that desperation had made them dangerous in ways that even the Red Scorpion's tactical doctrine could not fully account for. There had been sorcery, terrible warp-spawned powers unleashed without regard for consequence. A greater demon had been summoned, a towering monster of brass and blood that served the blood god Khorne. Tiberius had engaged it directly, trusting in his Dreadnought's armor to protect him while he bought time for his brothers to complete their mission. The battle had been brief and utterly one-sided. The demon prince, ancient beyond mortal comprehension and empowered by the worship of countless souls, had torn into him with savage glee. His power fist had managed to land one solid blow, crushing one of the demon's multiple arms, but the cost had been terrible. The creature's hellblade, a weapon forged from the essence of the warp itself, had carved through his armor like it was paper. His lascannon had been ripped away, his leg actuators had been crushed, and then, with a final contemptuous blow, the demon had thrown him, not just across the battlefield, but through reality itself, casting him into the Eye of Terror with force enough to shatter a fortress. Tiberius had expected death. He had hoped for it, prayed for it in the few seconds before unconsciousness claimed him. Death would have been a mercy, a release from the prison of metal and ceramite that had been his existence for the past 2 centuries. But death, it seems, had other plans. And now, as his systems struggle to reboot and his consciousness claws its way up from the depths of forced hibernation, he becomes aware that he is not alone. Something is touching his hull. Multiple somethings. The sensor array, damaged but still functional, paints a picture in his mind's eye that takes several long moments to process. He is surrounded by Orks. Dozens of them, maybe more, their crude biosignatures lighting up his tactical display like a constellation of violent intent. They are not attacking him, not yet, but their interest in his form is unmistakable and deeply disturbing. He can hear them now, their voices coming through with increasing clarity as his audio receptors complete their calibration. They are not speaking Imperial Gothic, of course, but the Dreadnought systems include translation protocols for dozens of Xeno's languages, and Orkish is among the most common. What he hears fills him with a horror that transcends even the knowledge of where he has awakened. They want to loot him. These Xeno scavengers, these brutal mockeries of true warriors, intend to tear him apart and repurpose his sacred machine form for their own crude technology. The thought is obscene beyond words, a violation so profound that it momentarily overrides even his survival instincts. He, brother ancient Tiberius, who has served the Emperor and the Red Scorpion's chapter for over 200 years, who has fought in countless battles and earned his place among the honored dead, is about to be reduced to spare parts for Ork war machines. Before we can fully understand the implications of this encounter, we must take a moment to appreciate exactly what a Space Marine Dreadnought represents, both practically and symbolically. These walking tombs are not merely weapons of war, though they function admirably in that capacity. They are living links to a chapter's history, repositories of wisdom and experience that span centuries or even millennia. They are revered as honored ancients, treated with a respect that borders on worship, for the warriors entombed within them have given everything in service to the Emperor and humanity. The process of becoming a Dreadnought is one of the most tragic fates that can befall a Space Marine. When a warrior of the Adeptus Astartes suffers wounds so catastrophic that even their enhanced physiology and the arts of the apothecaries cannot save them, they face a choice. They can die, their gene seed harvested to create future generations of Space Marines, their name inscribed in the chapter's rolls of honor. Or they can be preserved, what little remains of their broken body encased in amniotic fluid within an armored sarcophagus, and that sarcophagus installed within the chassis of a Dreadnought. For most Space Marines, death is the preferable option. To be entombed in a Dreadnought is to give up everything that made one human. The warrior's organic body is reduced to little more than a brain, a few vital organs, and perhaps a torso if they are fortunate. Their limbs are gone, replaced by weapons and systems of the Dreadnought itself. They will never again feel the wind on their face, never taste food or drink, never know the companionship of their battle brothers except through the filtered, mechanical interface of their new form. The sarcophagus becomes their entire world, a coffin in which they must spend eternity, experiencing existence only through sensors and optical arrays that translate the world into streams of data. Worse still is the psychological burden. The extended neural interface required to pilot a dreadnought causes immense mental stress. Time becomes meaningless, memories fade and blur together, and the pilot's grip on their own identity slowly erodes like sand beneath a relentless tide. This is why dreadnoughts spend most of their existence in stasis sleep, awakened only in times of great need or when their counsel is required for vital matters. Each awakening costs them something, takes another piece of whoever they once were. Eventually, after centuries or millennia of this half-life, many dreadnought pilots lose themselves entirely, becoming little more than war machines that can speak, guided by reflex and training rather than true consciousness. The Red Scorpions, chapter to which our unfortunate brother Ancient belongs, represents an interesting case study in space marine culture. They are known throughout the Imperium as absolute purists, warriors whose devotion to the Codex Astartes and the purity of their gene seed borders on fanaticism. They refuse to work alongside abhumans, reject any hint of mutation or deviation from the human norm, and maintain their genetic legacy with a zeal that even other Space Marine chapters find excessive. Their apothecaries hold positions of power second only to the chapter master himself, for in a chapter that venerates purity above all else, the keepers of the gene seed are the guardians of the soul. This obsession with purity makes the Red Scorpions paradoxically both stronger and more brittle than many other chapters. Their gene seed is remarkably stable, showing over 94% genetic purity, a rate that would make them ideal candidates for creating new chapters in a theoretical new founding. Yet this same obsession has led them to refuse cooperation with other Imperial forces at critical moments, and their rigid adherence to doctrine has sometimes blinded them to tactical flexibility that might have saved lives. For a warrior of the Red Scorpions to end up in the Eye of Terror, cast into the very heart of chaos and corruption, represents a fate worse than death. Everything they stand for, every principle they have devoted their lives to upholding, is antithetical to this place. The Eye of Terror is mutation given form, corruption made manifest, a realm where the very concept of purity becomes a cruel joke. That Tiberius has survived here at all, maintaining some measure of his identity and resistance to the warping influence of chaos, speaks to either remarkable strength of will or the protection offered by the Dreadnought's sacred machine form. How did he come to be here? The battle that ended with him being cast into the Eye was not the Red Scorpions' first encounter with the forces of chaos, nor would it have been their last had fate been kinder. The chapter has a long history of fighting traitors and heretics, of standing firm against the corruption that seeks to unmake the Imperium from within. But even the strongest will can be overcome by sufficient force, and the powers of the warp are nothing if not sufficiently forceful. When the demon prince threw Tiberius through the barrier between real space and the immaterium, it did not do so out of mercy or to be rid of an irritating opponent. It did so because demons are creatures of malice, and what greater malice could there be than to cast a proud warrior of the Imperium into the very hell he had spent his life fighting against? We do not know how long Tiberius has lain dormant in the Eye of Terror. Time flows strangely here, pooling and eddying in ways that defy mortal understanding. What feels like days might be centuries. What seems like an eternity might pass in the blink of an eye. The Dreadnought's internal chronometer, designed to function in the hostile environments of war, has been rendered useless by the warped nature of this place. All Tiberius knows, as consciousness slowly returns, is that he has been here too long. Far, far too long. The Orks, meanwhile, are having what they would describe as a proper good time. For beings whose entire culture revolves around violence, scavenging, and the joy of a good fight, The discovery of a Space Marine Dreadnought represents the kind of opportunity that comes along maybe once in an Ork's lifetime, if they are very lucky. Indeed, Gragmek has already begun making plans, his crude but effective mind working through the possibilities. If they can get this thing working, properly looted and customized with good Orky modifications, it could serve as the centerpiece of his warband. Imagine it, he thinks. A proper, stompy war machine painted in his colors, bristling with guns and maybe a few extra pointy bits for good measure. The other warbands in the Eye would have to respect that. They would have to recognize Gragmek Ironjaw as a boss worth following. Of course, getting the Dreadnought working is going to be the tricky part. Orks have an instinctive understanding of technology that borders on the supernatural. Their mech boys possess knowledge of engineering and mechanics that is encoded directly into their genetic structure, inherited from the ancient Old Ones who created their species millions of years ago. But Space Marine technology, particularly something as complex and sacred as a Dreadnought, operates on principles that are foreign even to Ork intuition. The machine spirit that inhabits such a device is ancient and proud, unwilling to submit to the crude ministrations of Xenos scavengers. And there is the small matter of the Space Marine inside, who presumably has opinions about being turned into an Ork war machine. To truly understand why this encounter is so bizarre, so darkly comedic in its implications, we need to examine Ork culture and psychology in greater detail. Orks are not, despite appearances and the propaganda of the Imperium, stupid. They are profoundly, almost aggressively pragmatic. Their entire civilization, if such a term can even be applied to their anarchic society, is built around a simple principle. If it works, use it. If it doesn't work, hit it until it does. If it still doesn't work, use it as a club to hit something else. This pragmatism extends to their approach to technology. Orks do not innovate in the way humans do, through careful research and development. Instead, their mech boys simply know how to build things, the knowledge bubbling up from their genetic code, like water from a spring. Need a gun? A mech boy knows how to cobble one together from scrap metal and spare parts. Need a vehicle? Same principle applies. The resulting creations should not work. They violate fundamental laws of physics, rely on components that are barely connected, and operate with margins of safety that would make any Imperial engineer weep with despair. Yet they do work, at least when Orks are using them, because Orks believe they will work. This collective belief, powered by their latent psychic abilities, literally warps reality to make their technology functional. But Orks do not merely create their own technology. They loot. Enthusiastically, constantly, with a dedication that borders on religious fervor. The Death Skulls clan in particular has turned looting into an art form. But even Orks of other clans understand the value of scavenging enemy, equipment, Imperial tanks, Tau battle suits, Elder weaponry, even Necron technology. All of it can be looted, modified, and repurposed for Ork use. The mech boys will strip away the original systems, replace them with good Orky gubbins, paint the whole thing in clan colors, and voila, you have a perfectly functional looted wagon. The fact that the original builders would not recognize their creation is beside the point. It works. That is all that matters. There are legends among the Orks of particularly skilled looters who managed to steal and modify things that should have been impossible to loot. Grabber Gutsbag, for instance, is said to have looted an Imperial Titan, one of the god machines that tower over battlefields like walking fortresses. Other tales speak of Orks who looted Eldar Wraith Knights, Tau Riptides, even Tyrannid bioforms that were somehow convinced or forced to serve their new greenskin masters. These stories may be exaggerated, embellished with each telling, until they bear little resemblance to whatever truth they originated from. But they speak to a fundamental aspect of Ork psychology. There is no prize too valuable, no technology too advanced, no theft too audacious to attempt. The only limit is the Ork's imagination, and fortunately for the rest of the galaxy, their imagination has certain boundaries. Gragmek's warband includes a dozen mech boys of varying skill and specialization. The most skilled among them is a hunched, scarred specimen called Zogwart, who has survived long enough in the Eye of Terror to develop a kind of manic cunning that passes for wisdom among his kind. Zogwart has looted and modified Imperial technology before. He has created trucks from the chassis of destroyed Rhino transports, weapons from the wreckage of crashed Imperial aircraft, even armor plates scavenged from dead space marines and beaten into shapes that will fit an Ork's bulkier frame. But he has never worked on anything like a Dreadnought. As Zogwart circles the fallen war machine, his mechanical eye clicking and whirring as it attempts to process what he is seeing, he experiences something unusual for an Ork: doubt. Not doubt that the Dreadnought can be looted. Everything can be looted if you are determined enough. But doubt about whether he possesses the skill to do so without destroying something important in the process. The Dreadnought is not just a vehicle, it is a fusion of machine and living being, a synthesis of technology and biology that even the Imperium only barely understands. The systems that keep the Space Marine alive are delicate beyond measure, maintained by machine spirits and ancient programming that predates the Imperium itself. One wrong cut, one misplaced hammer blow, and the whole thing could shut down permanently. But Zogwart is an Ork, and doubt is merely a challenge to be overcome. He calls over his assistants, a mob of lesser mech boys and Gretchen helpers, who immediately begin bringing tools and equipment: crude cutting torches, pneumatic hammers, welding equipment that looks like it was assembled from spare parts in a junkyard, which it almost certainly was. The plan, such as it is, involves carefully removing the external armor plates to access the systems beneath, identifying the key components that make the Dreadnought function, and then seeing what can be modified, replaced, or improved with proper Orky technology. The first problem becomes apparent almost immediately. The Dreadnought's armor plates are not simply bolted on. They are part of an integrated system, sealed with techniques that the Imperium no longer fully understands, and coated with blessings and wards that resist even Ork tools. Zogwart's cutting torch, which should be able to slice through ceramite with ease, barely scratches the surface. His pneumatic hammers bounce off with dull thunks that suggest the armor is somehow absorbing the impacts. Even the sacred unguents and machine oils that mech boys use to appease particularly stubborn spirits seem to have no effect. It is at this point that Brother Ancient Tiberius decides he has had quite enough of being poked and prodded by Xenos scum. His systems, while damaged, are not completely non-functional. He still has control over his remaining arm, the one that ends in a power fist. He still has limited mobility, though movement will be agonizing without proper maintenance and repairs. And he still has his voice, that mechanical rasp that emerges from voxcasters built into the Dreadnought's hull. When he speaks, the words are in High Gothic, the formal language of the Imperium, delivered with all the authority and rage that 2 centuries of service have granted him. Xenos filth, you dare lay hands upon the sacred form of the Adeptus Astartes. You dare to defile a servant of the God Emperor with your presence. I am Brother Ancient Tiberius of the Red Scorpions chapter, and I have walked the battlefield when your ancestors were still spores in the ground. Back away now, and I may grant you the mercy of a swift death. The effect on the Orks is not quite what Tiberius had hoped for. Instead of fear or even caution, his words provoke a wave of excitement that ripples through the assembled greenskins, like electricity. The fact that the Dreadnought can talk, that it is awake and aware, transforms it from an interesting piece of salvage into something infinitely more valuable, a proper fight. Several of the larger boys immediately begin hooting and hollering, smacking their choppers against whatever surface is handy in anticipation of violence. Gragmek Ironjaw's grin widens until it threatens to split his face in half. Even Zogwart, who had been approaching the task with something like caution, seems energized by this development. Tiberius, realizing that his attempt at intimidation has backfired spectacularly, makes a decision. If he is to die here, cast into this hell and unable to return to his chapter, he will at least die fighting. With tremendous effort, He forces his damaged systems to respond. The power fist, which has lain dormant for so long, suddenly crackles with energy. Ancient motors groan as they struggle to lift the Dreadnought's mass from the ground. Warning indicators flash across his internal displays, screaming that his power reserves are critically low, that his actuators are damaged beyond safety parameters, that continuing to function will likely result in catastrophic system failure. He ignores them all. He is Space Marine, one of the Emperor's chosen, and he will not go quietly into the dark. The resulting battle is brief, brutal, and utterly one-sided, though not in the way one might expect. Tiberius manages to rise to his feet, an achievement that requires every ounce of his remaining strength. He swings his power fist in a wide arc, clearing a space around him as Orks scatter to avoid being pulped by the massive weapon. For a moment, just a moment, he feels something like his old self. He is a warrior again, not just a consciousness trapped in a shell of metal, but a true servant of the Emperor, dealing death to the enemies of mankind. Then his power cells fail, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once. The energy field surrounding his power fist flickers and dies. His optical sensors cut out, plunging him into darkness. His motor functions seize up, locking him in place like a statue. And brother ancient Tiberius, who has fought for 200 years and survived wounds that would have killed a dozen lesser warriors, finds himself helpless and immobile, surrounded by Orks, who are now very, very interested in taking him apart to see what makes him tick. What follows is a process that can only be described as organized chaos. Zogvort, emboldened by the Dreadnought's failure, and excited by the confirmation that there is indeed a living being inside the machine, sets his mech boys to work with renewed enthusiasm. They begin by attempting to restore power to the Dreadnought's systems, not out of any concern for the Space Marine inside, but because a functioning Dreadnought is infinitely more valuable than a dead one. Ork power cells are rigged up to the access ports, crude but functional cables connecting the alien technology to Imperial systems that were never designed to interface with Xenos equipment. The results are unpredictable, which is exactly how Orks like things. Some systems surge to life with full power, while others spark and smoke as incompatible energy flows fry their delicate circuitry. Tiberius's optical sensors flicker back online, giving him a stuttering, unreliable view of the Orks working around him. His audio receptors pick up their crude speech, their excited jabbering about this gubbins and that doohickey. He can feel them cutting into his armor now, not with the careful precision of tech priests, but with the brutal efficiency of scavengers who care nothing for the sanctity of the machine they are desecrating. The experience is horrifying on a level that Tiberius struggles to process. He has been wounded in battle before, has felt his armor breached and his body torn by enemy weapons. But this is different. This is not the heat of combat, where adrenaline and duty can override pain and fear. This is slow, methodical violation. Each cut the Orks make into his armor feels like a personal attack. Each component they remove, examine, and either discard or set aside for later use feels like a piece of his identity being stolen. He tries to shut down, to return to the blessed unconsciousness that has been his refuge for so long. But the Ork power cells feeding into his systems won't allow it. They keep him awake, aware, forced to witness his own dismantling. Days pass, though time remains a meaningless concept in the eye of terror. The Orks work with surprising diligence, fueled by excitement and the prospect of creating something truly impressive. They catalogue every system, every component, mapping out in their crude but effective way how the Dreadnought functions. The sarcophagus itself, the armored tomb that houses what remains of Tiberius, proves to be the most challenging component. It is sealed with technologies that even Orks cannot simply hammer open, protected by wards and machine spirits that resist every attempt at forced access. This presents Gragmech with a dilemma. He could order his mech boys to cut the sarcophagus open by force, but doing so would almost certainly kill the Space Marine inside. And while a dead dreadnought has value as salvage, a living one that can potentially be forced or tricked into serving the warband, would be infinitely more valuable. So instead of simply breaking the seal, Zogwart begins trying something different. He begins trying to communicate with the dreadnought's machine spirit, speaking to it in the same way he would speak to the spirit of any other machine he wishes to understand. This might seem absurd to an outside observer, but it reveals an interesting aspect of Ork technology and belief. Orks understand, in a way that even the Adeptus Mechanicus sometimes forgets, that machines have spirits. These spirits are not metaphors or poetic descriptions of complex systems. They are real, conscious entities that inhabit and animate technology. The difference is that where the Mechanicus approaches machine spirits with prayer and ritual, Orks simply talk to them. They threaten them, cajole them, bargain with them, whatever seems most likely to get the desired result. To Tiberius's absolute astonishment, the Dreadnought's machine spirit responds to Zogwart's crude ministrations, not with acceptance or cooperation, but with acknowledgement. The spirit has been dormant for so long, starved of proper maintenance and respect, that even the attention of a Xenos mechanic is preferable to continued neglect. It does not open the sarcophagus or grant the Orks access to Tiberius's life support systems, but it does begin to communicate, feeding them information about basic systems, power requirements, the functions of various components. This unwilling cooperation between Ork mech and machine spirit results in something that should not be possible, but somehow is anyway. The Orks begin to understand the Dreadnought not as imperial technology, but as simply technology, stripping away the religious reverence and seeing it for what it truly is: a very sophisticated life support system wrapped around weapons platforms and mounted on mobile legs. Once that conceptual breakthrough occurs, the modifications begin in earnest. Ork technology starts to be integrated with imperial systems in ways that would make any tech priest weep. A force field generator, looted from an imperial tank months ago, is rigged up to provide additional protection. Extra weapons are mounted wherever there is space. Big shooters, rockets, even a crude close combat weapon that looks like someone welded a chainsaw to a power claw and hoped for the best. The armor plates are patched with whatever is available, resulting in a patchwork appearance that bears the colors of Gragmek's warband: red and black with lots of checkerboard patterns. Spikes are added, because Orks believe spikes make everything better. An enormous metal jaw is welded to the front of the sarcophagus, giving the Dreadnought's face a leering, aggressive appearance that perfectly captures Ork aesthetics. Through all of this, Tiberius remains conscious, trapped within his sarcophagus, and forced to endure every modification, every desecration of his sacred form. He prays constantly, reciting the litanies and catechisms that have sustained him through 2 centuries of service. He calls upon the Emperor for strength, for deliverance, for death if deliverance is not possible. But the Emperor, if he hears these prayers from the heart of the Eye of Terror, does not answer. Perhaps he cannot reach into this place where reality and nightmare merge. Perhaps he judges that Tiberius's fate is deserved, punishment for some failure or sin. Or perhaps, most terrible of all, the Emperor simply does not care about the fate of one fallen warrior among the billions who die in his name every day. The environment of the Eye of Terror itself plays a role in what happens next. This is not real space, where the laws of physics operate according to predictable patterns. Here, belief shapes reality to a degree that exceeds even the Orks' normal reality warping abilities. The warband's collective expectation that the looted Dreadnought will function, combined with the machine spirit's growing resignation to its fate, begins to create something new. Not imperial technology, not Ork technology, but something in between, a hybrid born from necessity and the warped nature of the Eye itself. The corruption of chaos begins to seep in as well, though more slowly than one might expect. The Orks themselves are remarkably resistant to chaos corruption. Their psychology is too simple, too straightforward to be easily manipulated by the complex temptations of the dark gods. They want to fight, loot, and maybe build some impressive war machines along the way. There are no deep psychological hooks for chaos to exploit. no hidden desires or suppressed emotions. The worst that usually happens is that orcs might acquire new mutations that make them bigger and stronger, which they view as improvements rather than corruption. Tiberius, however, is not so fortunate. His mind, sophisticated enough to comprehend the horror of his situation, becomes a target for the whispering voices that permeate the eye. The Chaos Gods care nothing for individual mortals, but the torment of a space marine, particularly one who has resisted corruption for so long, provides a certain entertainment value. Horn whispers, promises of endless battle, of rage unleashed without restraint. Nurgle offers acceptance of his degraded state, peace through surrender to entropy. Slanesh suggests that his pain could become pleasure if only he would stop resisting. And Tsinch, always the most subtle, simply laughs and suggests that his suffering is all part of some greater plan. The Red Scorpion's training in resisting corruption serves Tiberius well, but it is a shield that grows weaker with each passing day. The combination of physical torment, psychological isolation, and the ambient corruption of the eye slowly erodes his defenses. He begins to hear the whispers not as external threats, but as thoughts that might be his own. The line between his identity and the corruption trying to overwhelm it grows progressively thinner. Meanwhile, the Orks have completed their modifications and are eager to test their creation. The looted Dreadnought, which they have named Dustompy Khan, in a display of Ork creativity, is a sight that would drive any Imperial observer to fury or despair. The once proud war machine of the Red Scorpions has been transformed into something grotesque, a monument to Ork ingenuity and complete disregard for the sanctity of Imperial technology. Yet it is undeniably functional. The weapon systems, now a mixture of Imperial and Ork components, respond to crude controls. The legs, reinforced with Ork engineering and powered by a combination of the original reactor and looted power cells, can support the increased weight of all the modifications. Even the force field flickers into existence when activated, its protective bubble shimmering with a greenish tint that speaks to the Ork power source sustaining it. The question of what to do with the Space Marine inside remains unresolved. Gragmek wants to use the Dreadnought as a war machine, but doing so requires some level of cooperation from Tiberius. The Ork war boss is not stupid enough to think the Space Marine will willingly serve, but there are ways to compel obedience. Orks are experienced in the use of captured enemy equipment, and they have developed crude but effective methods for dealing with uncooperative spirits, both machine and organic. Zogwart proposes a solution that is elegant in its brutality. They will wire new controls directly into the Dreadnought systems, bypassing the Space Marine's volition entirely. The Dreadnought will become a puppet, with the Orks pulling the strings. Tiberius will remain alive inside, aware of what is happening, but unable to prevent his body from being used against everything he believes in. It is a fate worse than death, worse even than corruption, to be forced to witness his own arms wielding weapons against Imperial forces, to watch through his optical sensors as he becomes a tool of the Xenos he has devoted his life to destroying. Before this plan can be implemented, however, events in the Eye of Terror take an unexpected turn. The warband's presence, and particularly the psychic resonance of so many Orks gathered in one place, has attracted attention. Not from Imperial forces, which are rarely foolish enough to venture deep into the Eye, but from the native inhabitants of this nightmare realm. A warband of Chaos Space Marines, warriors of the Black Legion who serve Abaddon the Despoiler, has detected the Ork activity and decided to investigate. The resulting battle is everything Orks could hope for, and everything Tiberius has been dreading. The Chaos Marines attack without warning, emerging from a warp rift that tears open in the very air. Gragmek's warband responds with characteristic enthusiasm, throwing themselves at these armored enemies with gleeful abandon. The fighting is close and brutal, exactly the kind of engagement where Orks excel. But the Chaos Marines are veterans of 10,000 years of war, and they fight with a discipline and coordination that the anarchic Orks cannot match. In the confusion of battle, with Orks and Chaos Marines locked in deadly combat, Zogwart makes a decision. He activates Dastompy Khan, using the crude control system they have rigged up to force the looted Dreadnought into combat. Tiberius feels his body move against his will, his legs lurching forward with none of the grace he once possessed. The weapon systems activate, firing at targets he has no part in selecting. He is a passenger in his own form, forced to witness as Ork controls make him fight not against the enemy, but according to their crude tactical doctrine. The irony is not lost on him. Here he stands, a warrior of the Red Scorpions forced to fight alongside Orks against Chaos Space Marines. He should be targeting the Orks, purging these Xenos' filth from existence. But the Chaos Marines represent an even greater threat. Traitors who have turned their backs on the Emperor and embraced the ruinous powers. His training, his doctrine, his very existence as a Space Marine screams at him to prioritize the traitors. And so, in a moment of bitter clarity, Tiberius makes a choice. He stops resisting the Ork controls. Not completely, not enough to grant them true mastery over his form, but enough to allow coordination, to permit the kind of efficient combat operations that make Dreadnoughts such terrifying weapons. His weapon systems, now guided by 2 centuries of combat experience rather than Ork instinct, begin targeting with lethal precision. His movements, informed by tactical doctrine that the Orks could never hope to understand, become fluid rather than lurching. Dastompy Khan transforms from a crude war machine into something approaching a true Dreadnought again. The effect on the battle is immediate and decisive. Chaos Marines, who had been pushing the Orks back, find themselves facing a new threat, one that fights with coordination and skill that should not exist in Ork forces. Tiberius's Lascannon burns through power armor. His power fist crushes helmets and shatters ceramite. His heavy bolters tear apart any traitor foolish enough to present an exposed flank. He hates every moment of it, hates that he must rely on Ork power systems and Ork modifications to function. But he hates the traitors more, and that hatred gives him strength. The Orks, meanwhile, are absolutely delighted. Here is proof that their looted Dreadnought works even better than expected. The fact that it is fighting more effectively than they could have managed on their own does not diminish their pride. If anything, it enhances it. They looted this thing, they fixed it up, and now it is stomping enemies like a proper war machine should. Gragmek's chest swells with pride as he watches Dastompy Khan tear through the Chaos Marines formation. The battle ends with the Chaos Marines retreating back through their warp rift, bloodied and defeated. They have learned that this particular Ork warband is more dangerous than anticipated, and they will return with greater force. But for now, the Orks have won, and they celebrate with the kind of enthusiasm that only their kind can muster. Dastompy Khan, the looted Dreadnought that turned the tide of battle, becomes a symbol of the warband's power and cunning. Tiberius, his systems powered down again now that the battle has ended, has time to contemplate what he has done. He has fought alongside Orks. He has allowed Xenos to control his actions, to use him as a weapon in their crude hands. He has become everything his chapter would despise, everything he swore never to become. And yet, he is still alive, still conscious, still capable of destroying the enemies of the Emperor, even if the means of doing so are unorthodox to the point of heresy. This creates an interesting philosophical question that will occupy him during the long periods of inactivity that follow. Is it better to die pure, but useless, or to live compromised, but still capable of inflicting harm on the Emperor's enemies? The Codex Astartes provides no clear guidance on this matter. The teachings of his chapter, with their obsession with purity, would undoubtedly condemn his continued existence. But some deeper part of him, the part that remembers being human before he became a space marine, rebels against the idea that death is always preferable to compromise. The Eye of Terror has a way of forcing such compromises on everyone who enters it. The pure die quickly here, unable to adapt to the constantly shifting nature of reality. The survivors are those who can bend without breaking, who can maintain their core identity while making the practical concessions necessary to continue existing. Tiberius is discovering this truth in the most brutal way possible. As weeks turn into what might be months, time still has no real meaning in the eye. A strange relationship develops between the Space Marine and his captors. It is not friendship. It could never be friendship. But it is something, a mutual recognition of utility if nothing else. The Orks want a war machine that can help them fight bigger and better battles. Tiberius wants to continue destroying the enemies of the Emperor, even if doing so requires tolerating the presence of Xenos. Neither side trusts the other. Both sides need what the other offers. Zogwart, in particular, develops a kind of proprietary pride in his creation. He continues to tinker with the Stompy Khan, making adjustments and improvements based on observed performance in battle. Some of these modifications are purely Orky. More guns, bigger explosions, spikes in interesting places. But others show a surprising sophistication, as Zogwart begins to understand not just how the Dreadnought functions, but why it was designed the way it was. He learns that some systems cannot be replaced with Ork equivalents because they serve functions too subtle for Ork technology to replicate. He discovers that the machine spirit, while resigned to its fate, still has preferences about how it is treated and maintained. This gradual understanding allows Zogwart to make more intelligent choices about maintenance and repair. When Stompy Khan takes damage in combat, as it inevitably does, Zogwart is able to fix problems without simply replacing everything with Ork parts. He learns which Imperial components must be preserved, which can be modified, and which can be safely replaced. In the process, he becomes something unique, an Ork mech who partially understands Imperial technology, not just as something to be looted, but as a system with its own internal logic and coherence. Tiberius, for his part, begins to understand the Orks in ways that no loyal servant of the Imperium should. He observes their society, their interactions, their strange code of honor that revolves around strength and cleverness. He sees that they are not mindless monsters, though they are certainly monstrous. They have personalities, preferences, even something approaching culture. Gragmek is ambitious and cunning, always looking for opportunities to increase his warband's power. Zogwart is curious, driven by a desire to understand how things work that transcends simple looting. The other Orks have their own quirks and characteristics, hidden beneath the veneer of crude violence that defines their species. This understanding does not make him like them. It does not make their presence any less offensive to his sensibilities, but it does make them predictable, and predictability is something that can be exploited. When the Orks are preparing for battle, Tiberius can anticipate their tactics based on his growing knowledge of how they think. When they are making modifications to his systems, he can sometimes influence their choices by making certain responses seem more satisfying than others. He cannot control them, but he can subtly guide them, steering them away from changes that would be truly catastrophic and toward those that might preserve some vestige of his functionality as a true dreadnought. The corruption of chaos continues to whisper at the edges of his consciousness, but it finds less purchase now. The constant activity, the endless series of battles and repairs and preparations for new battles leaves him little time to dwell on his situation. The Chaos Gods promise transcendence, but Tiberius has no interest in transcending his current existence. He wants only to endure, to continue functioning as long as possible, to destroy as many enemies of the Emperor as he can before his systems finally fail completely. This creates an interesting dynamic where Tiberius, brother ancient of the Red Scorpions, becomes something unprecedented. A space marine who exists in a state of perpetual compromise, neither fully loyal to the Emperor nor surrendered to chaos, neither truly free nor completely enslaved. He is a walking contradiction, a symbol of everything his chapter stands against, yet still somehow recognizable as a servant of the Imperium. The Orks, meanwhile, have no philosophical crisis about this arrangement. To them, Dastompi Khan is simply a really good piece of loot that occasionally fights better than expected. They do not care about the Marines' internal struggles or the spiritual implications of what they have done. They care that when they point the Dreadnought at something and tell it to shoot, the target gets shot. Everything else is irrelevant. Multiple battles follow, each one reinforcing this strange arrangement. The warband encounters other forces in the Eye of Terror, demon packs serving various chaos gods, renegade Imperial Guard units that have somehow survived in this hell, even other Ork warbands competing for resources and territory. In each engagement, Dastompi Khan proves its worth, and each time it does, Tiberius finds himself marginally more integrated into the warband's operations. There is an incident where a greater demon of Tzinch attempts to corrupt the warband, offering power and knowledge in exchange for service. Gragmek, displaying the kind of straightforward thinking that serves Orks well in the Eye, simply orders his boys to shoot the demon until it goes away. When the creature tries to subvert Tiberius specifically, promising him release from his prison if he will turn on the Orks, the Space Marine refuses. Not out of loyalty to the Greenskins, but because serving demons is worse than tolerating Xenos. The demon, frustrated by this stubborn refusal, launches a direct attack, and the resulting battle sees Orks and Space Marine fighting side by side against a common enemy. This cooperation in battle gradually erodes the absolute hostility between Tiberius and the warband. He will never call them allies. He will never forget that they are Xenos filth who deserve only extermination. But in the context of the Eye of Terror, where everything is a threat and survival depends on pragmatic choices, he accepts their presence. They accept his. The arrangement continues. What becomes of the looted Dreadnought in the long term? This is where things become truly speculative. For the nature of the Eye of Terror makes long-term anything difficult to predict. In one possible future, Tiberius's systems eventually fail completely, worn down by the combination of battle damage, Ork modifications, and the corrosive environment of the warp. He dies, and the Orks simply strip his Dreadnought for parts, recycling the components into other projects. His sacrifice, his compromise, his survival, all of it amounts to nothing more than a footnote in the endless war. In another possibility, the warband grows powerful enough to escape the Eye of Terror, launching a raid back into real space. Imagine Imperial forces encountering an Ork warband that includes a looted Red Scorpion's Dreadnought. The confusion, the horror, the frantic Vox traffic trying to understand how such a thing could exist. Tiberius might try to communicate, to warn them of what is happening, but would they believe him? Or would they assume he has been corrupted, turned traitor, become one of the fallen? Perhaps the darkest possibility is that the Eye's corruption eventually does succeed, not through grand temptation or dramatic conversion, but through the slow erosion of everything that made Tiberius who he was. The memories fade, the principles blur, the distinction between fighting alongside Orks because it is expedient and fighting alongside them because it feels natural becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. He does not fall to chaos in any traditional sense. He simply ceases to be the warrior he once was, becoming instead something new, something the Eye has created from the raw materials of his identity. Or perhaps, in the grim darkness of the far future where miracles are rare but not impossible, Tiberius endures. Perhaps his strength of will, tempered by centuries of service and 200 years entombed in the Dreadnought, proves sufficient to resist even the Eye's corruption. Perhaps he maintains his identity, his purpose, his sense of self despite everything. And perhaps, someday, through some improbable chain of events, he finds his way back to his chapter. What welcome would await him there? Would the Red Scorpions see a hero who survived the impossible, or a contaminated relic that must be destroyed to maintain the chapter's purity? The truth is, we cannot know. The Eye of Terror does not operate according to predictable narratives. Time flows strangely there. cause and effect become suggestions rather than rules. What happened to one looted dreadnought on one demon world might be completely different from what happens to another in an adjacent reality. The warp cares nothing for consistency. What we can say with certainty is that this encounter, this strange meeting between Orks and a fallen space marine in the heart of chaos itself, illuminates something fundamental about the Warhammer 40,000 setting. It shows us that there are fates worse than death. It demonstrates that pragmatism and ideology can come into brutal conflict, forcing choices that should never have to be made. It reveals that even the most carefully maintained boundaries between faction and faction, between acceptable and unacceptable, can become blurred when survival is at stake. The Orks represent pure pragmatism, unbound by the ideological constraints that hamper other races. They see a thing, they want the thing, they take the thing. No moral quandaries, no philosophical debates about whether looting is wrong. It works, therefore it is good. This mindset, while it produces a chaotic and violent society, also grants them a kind of adaptability that more civilized races cannot match. They can incorporate enemy technology because they do not see it as enemy technology. They see it as technology, period. The Space Marines, particularly the Red Scorpions, represent the opposite extreme. Everything is categorized, everything has its proper place, deviation is corruption. This rigidity provides strength. Knowing absolutely where you stand and what you believe can carry a warrior through situations that would break lesser beings. But it also creates brittleness. When the rules no longer apply, when survival requires compromise, the rigid break where the flexible merely bend. Tiberius's tragedy is that he exists at the intersection of these two philosophies. He is Space Marine enough to be horrified by his situation, but human enough to choose survival over principle. The Orks are probably unaware of the agonies they inflict on him through their simple act of looting and repurposing. To them, he is a component, albeit an interesting one. That they are torturing a consciousness with every modification, every battle, every day of continued existence never occurs to them, because Orks do not think that way. There is something darkly appropriate about this encounter happening in the Eye of Terror specifically. The Eye represents everything the Imperium fears and fights against: corruption, chaos, the dissolution of all order and meaning. Yet it is also a place where the Imperium's enemies thrive, where different rules apply. The Orks, with their instinctive resistance to chaos and their pragmatic approach to existence, can survive here where purer beings would be overwhelmed. The fact that they use corrupted Imperials and looted Imperial technology to do so is simply the Eye's way of adding insult to injury. For the broader galaxy, this incident matters very little. One dreadnought, one warband, one tiny drama playing out in the vastness of the Eye. It is background noise in a galaxy where billions die every day and entire worlds are consumed by war. But for Tiberius, trapped in his sarcophagus and forced to endure this half-life, it is everything. It is his entire universe, reduced to the cramped confines of an Ork warband's territory and the constant cycle of battle, repair, and waiting for the next battle. The Red Scorpions chapter, if they are even aware that Tiberius still exists, have probably declared him dead. His name would be inscribed in the chapter's rolls of honor, his service commemorated, his gene seed lost. The chapter moves on. It must move on. There are always more battles to fight, more enemies to purge, more crusades to launch. Individual warriors, no matter how honored, are ultimately expendable. The chapter endures. That is what matters. But Tiberius endures too, in his own terrible way. Not in the manner the chapter would approve, not with the purity they venerate, but he endures. Every day that his systems continue to function is a small victory over the Eye's corruption. Every battle where he destroys the enemies of the Emperor, even if those battles also help Orks, is a reaffirmation of purpose. He may be compromised, He may be fallen, but he is not defeated. Not yet. This is, perhaps, what makes this scenario so compelling as a thought exercise. It is easy to imagine grand heroics, noble sacrifices, warriors dying gloriously in defense of principles. It is much harder to contemplate the messy compromises that real survival sometimes requires. Tiberius should die. His chapter's doctrine demands it. The Codex Astartes, while not explicitly addressing this exact situation, would almost certainly condemn his continued cooperation with Xenos. But the alternative is to shut down, to embrace oblivion, and something in him rebels against that surrender. The Orks, for their part, have no idea that they have created a philosophical crisis through their simple act of looting. To them, this is a success story. They found a thing, they fixed the thing, now the thing works for them. This is how Orks approach all problems. It is simultaneously their greatest strength and their greatest limitation. They can adapt to anything because they do not overthink adaptation. But they also cannot fully understand the implications of what they do, because that would require the kind of reflective thought that is alien to their psychology. As we close this examination of what happens when Orks find a Red Scorpion's Dreadnought in the Eye of Terror, we are left with more questions than answers. This is appropriate, for the Eye of Terror is not a place where neat resolutions occur. It is a place of eternal conflict, endless possibility, and outcomes that defy prediction. What we can say with certainty is that the encounter between these two forces, the brutal pragmatism of the Orks and the tragic idealism of a fallen space marine, creates something unique, something that could only exist in the specific madness of Warhammer 40,000. The galaxy is vast beyond comprehension. The Emperor's Imperium spans 1,000,000 worlds, each with billions of souls, each fighting desperately against the darkness that presses in from all sides. In the grand scheme of things, one dreadnought, one warband, one small drama in the Eye of Terror matters less than a single grain of sand on an endless beach. Yet for those involved, it matters absolutely. It is their entire existence, their struggle, their story. And so the cycle continues. The Orks fight, loot, and celebrate their victories. The Dreadnought endures, compromised but unbroken, destroying enemies while hating everything about his circumstances. The Eye of Terror watches with the dispassionate interest of a cosmic force that cares nothing for individual suffering or triumph. And somewhere, in the cold void between stars, the war that has raged for 10,000 years and will rage for 10,000 more continues without pause. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between battles, there is also survival. Messy, uncomfortable, ideologically impure survival, but survival nonetheless. Brother Ancient Tiberius of the Red Scorpions has learned this lesson in the harshest way possible. The Orks of Gragmek's warband have demonstrated it through their actions. And the Eye of Terror, that wound in reality itself, provides the stage where this strange drama unfolds. This is the nature of Warhammer 40,000. It is a setting where the high and the low, the noble and the pragmatic, the pure and the corrupt all exist in tension. Where Space Marines, the Emperor's finest warriors, can find themselves reduced to components in Xenos war machines. Where Orks, crude and violent though they may be, display a kind of genius in their ability to adapt and repurpose anything they find. Where even the most carefully maintained principles can be tested by circumstances beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. The story of what happens when Orks find a Red Scorpion's Dreadnought in the Eye of Terror is not really about Orks or Dreadnoughts or even the Eye itself. It is about the choices beings make when all their options are terrible. It is about the price of survival when survival requires abandoning everything you once believed. It is about the space between absolute principles and brutal reality, and what happens to those who find themselves trapped in that space. For anyone who has, Ever wondered about the practical realities behind the grand battles and heroic sacrifices depicted in Warhammer lore? This scenario provides uncomfortable answers. Not everyone dies a hero's death. Not every choice is between good and evil. Sometimes the choice is between degrees of terrible, and the survivors are those who can make peace with their compromises while still maintaining some core sense of who they are. Thank you so much for watching this exploration into one of the darker corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what might happen when two of the galaxy's most distinctive factions collide in the worst possible place, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. There are thousands more stories waiting to be told in the grim darkness of the far future, each one illuminating a different aspect of this rich, brutal setting. Until next time, remember, in the Eye of Terror, there are no good options. There are only survivors and those who become cautionary tales.